Hi, my name doesn't matter. Welcome to the deep end. Let's dive in. John chapter 2 says this. It says, on the third day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. And then if you jump down just a little bit to verse 6, it gives you a little bit more about the setting. Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. We can see 3 different things that John is trying to communicate to us about our Messiah from this passage. The gospel author of John begins the story of Jesus' ministry with this wedding feast at Cana. And you've heard the story, it's a pretty common one. Jesus turns water into wine and saves the entire party. Well, I just want to take a minute to look at some things within the setting of the wedding itself. Number 1, this is the 7th day. Did you notice it said on the 3rd day? Well, this is the 7th time that a specific day has been mentioned in the Gospel of John. The first one is in chapter 1 verse 29, then chapter 1 verse 35, then chapter 1 verse 39, then chapter 1 verse 43, and then there are 3 days mentioned here. I think the reason for that is pretty clear. At the very beginning of the setting, he says on the 3rd day. One of the things he's trying to tell you about Jesus is Jesus is actually the creator who has become a man, come down to earth to restore Sabbath rest. If you remember the book of Genesis, God creates everything in 6 days and then the 7th day rests. Did you ever notice that there's not an 8th day mentioned? There's a reason for that. You see, God never intended for that day to end. You were supposed to live in perfect harmony with God forever from the 7th day on. And so here, John is articulating for us that Jesus has come back to restore Sabbath rest to us and give us that 7th day bliss with him. And it starts the exact same way the book of Genesis does, with a wedding. Adam and Eve get married in Genesis. Here there's a couple getting married and Jesus shows up. In the book of Revelation, it also ends with a wedding. In Revelation chapter 22 verse 17, the marriage supper of the Lamb, where Jesus marries the church. Crazy, right? So the first thing that we see here is Jesus has returned to restore Sabbath rest. He is recreating our hearts and our souls and even recreating the religious practices we do. Number 2, did you see where Jesus shows up to? He doesn't show up in a desert or in a temple or off by himself. He begins his ministry by showing up at a wedding. Jesus comes to a party, and not just any party, but one of the biggest parties that you could imagine, with a personal, intimate family. So he shows up at a party. He doesn't require people that come to him. Contrast this with John the Baptist, who went out to a field by himself and stayed alone, and you had to go to him to hear the message. Jesus instead goes to a party. So I want you to hear this today. Jesus comes to you. He comes to where you are and joins you in what you're doing. And you need to be careful, because if you're engaged in the party, you might miss the point if you're not close to Jesus. You see, that's what happens in this story. So many people at the party, no one leaves the party following Jesus, except for the people who came with him. If we're at the party, we need to remember to stay as close to Jesus as possible so we see what he does and we can rejoice in the miracle. Number 3, Jesus shows up at a religious festival. You see these stone jars that are outside. They're representative of religious purification, and we know that because the gospel author tells us it. The emphasis of the story is these 6 stone water jars that Jesus has filled up to the brim with water, and then the servants draw from the jars. There's no indication that they draw from anywhere else. They draw from the jars, take to the master of the feast, give it to him, and he says, wow, this wine's amazing. What Jesus does here is he takes the things that are supposed to cleanse us and he repurposes them to be celebration. And I think Jesus wants to do that for you. See, I think in the American church, we are spending far too much time trying to make ourselves holy by our religious activity, and we've forgotten that we are only holy because Jesus Christ is holy. And so here, I believe that's the message that the gospel author is trying to get across, and he is telling you and telling me, I'm going to repurpose your religious system so that it would become a system of celebration, and I'm going to fill it with my spirit, with the wine of God, the best wine possible. What was once a religious, arduous task is now an act of celebration that God has come and put in your life. These religious ceremonies we give have one purpose: to celebrate and worship the King of all glory. So that's the setting. We'll look more at the other parts later. Thanks for joining me in the deep end. Now go get to work.